So g'day, I'm Scott Poynton and welcome to another podcast. And it is my privilege today to be talking to Tony Rinaudo. Tony Rinaudo is an Australian. Tony is known as the forest maker. And we have interviewed Tony on our podcast here in the past, 5, 6, I can't remember how many years ago. We were in a different situation there, sitting together in Jakarta, talking about Tony's work to bring forest regeneration back to the dry regions and other regions of the world, but certainly the dry regions of Africa and the Sahel, and his work that started all this in Niger many, many moons ago. We're going to touch on that so Tony can introduce his work, a little bit about his autobiography that he's just published, The Forest Underground, it's called, and Tony can tell us about that. But what we really want to talk about today, what I'm fascinated about, is the way that Tony has inspired millions and millions of farmers around the world to dive into something that they weren't doing before. So I'm interested in Tony's way of bringing change. Such an important thing today as we look at the lack of change that's happening on so many fronts, for example, on climate change and other things. And yet Tony, in his work, has inspired people to do things that they had otherwise not thought that they would do or even not thought possible. And I'm fascinated in that. So let's welcome Tony. Tony Rinaudo, welcome to our podcast. How are you?
Oh, good, Scott. So good to be back in the podcast with you again.
And in a different context, we're talking over Zoom now, but how wonderful that we're able to do that.
Yes, who would have thought that 5 years ago that we would be doing it in this way the next time?
I know. Now, Tony, give us an introduction to, your life and your work. You've recently published your autobiography, The Forest Underground, right, is the name?
That's correct. So, I guess you reach a certain stage in your life, and I was evaluating what's the best use of my time now. And over the years, various people had asked me, when are you going to write a book? And I just laughed. I haven't got enough story in me, nor would anybody read it. It's not interesting enough. But, I've done the direct face-to-face field work. And that was right for that stage in my life. And then when we came back to Australia, I did project management remotely and then visiting the projects from time to time. And that was good for that stage of life. Now, when I think about it, what's my responsibility? How can I best use my time? I want to inspire the next generation and also to give hope. As I speak in many different venues around the world, I see particularly young people, there's this sense of hopelessness with the state of the world and with climate change and so on. And I feel, if anything, the story of what was achieved I lived in Niger Republic, West Africa, and working through farmers, through communities, they fought back the Sahara Desert. And I thought, in essence, that's a story of hope. And if I can use that as a springboard to give a story of hope for this generation and the issues they face, then maybe writing a book isn't such a bad thing. And then, of course, COVID came along and I was grounded for 2 years, no travel, and I had absolutely no excuse.
No excuse indeed. And you've written a fantastic book that describes your life growing up in the Myrtleford region of Victoria and your journey to Africa and your discovery there of this whole concept of your own personal discovery, that moment of recognition, of understanding that you could take a different path. You'd been busy, trying to establish forests there to fight back the Sahara, to support the farming communities through tree planting. Utter and dismal failure. And then you had that moment where you leant down to let some air out of your tyres. Just tell us through that, Tony. Talk us through what you'd been doing and how that revelation moment occurred for you.
Oh, so it was 2.5 years of frustration. And I think, I was young at that stage, maybe, how old was I? Maybe 22, 23 years old. And you come to this situation with great ambition. You're going to leave your mark on the world sort of thing. And to have that crumble before you where every attempt that we made to work with communities in this tree restoration failed. And it wasn't for lack of trying. I studied, I read widely, I consulted the experts. We experimented with many different ways of getting these trees established, and nothing worked in an economically viable or sustainable way. it was crushing, really. It was a real hit on my ego. And I thought I was wasting my life. Why did I come out here? So that was the backdrop. And on this particular day, I had a pickup and trailer load of trees, driving them to the villages, knowing full well that most of those trees would die. The communities weren't interested. For all my efforts, behind my back, they called me the crazy white farmer, which in hindsight is understandable because they were struggling to make a living. They're often short of food. Who in their right mind would plant trees on their valuable farmland? So that was the situation. But there was a big part of me that felt, no, there must be a solution. It can't be a waste of time. There must be a way through this. And as I was letting the air pressure out, it was a very sandy track. And if you don't do that, you get bogged. And then looking north, south, east, west, in every direction, barely a tree, hopeless, absolute waste of time and money. How many $1 million would it take? How many years? How many hundred staff would you need to make a dent on this landscape? And actually, I guess I'm a person of faith, actually threw up a desperate prayer. Please forgive us for destroying the gift of your creation. But as a consequence of that destruction, people are suffering. They don't know where the next meal's coming from. They're fearful for tomorrow. But help us, show us what to do, open our eyes. And it was at that point, and the ridiculous thing is, Scott, I'd been on this track for 2.5 years, almost every week, eyes open, but totally blind to what had been there all along. And on this particular day, this useless looking, what I thought, desert bush, desert shrub, caught my attention, and I took the trouble to walk over and take a closer look. And immediately when I saw the shape of the leaf, it was Philostigma reticulata. It's got a very distinctive camel-shaped leaf. And of course, a leaf is like a signature for most tree species. Everything changed. It's not a bush. It's not a weed. It's a tree that's been chopped down. And in that instant, I realized because there are millions of these bushes strewn across that agricultural landscape, the solution literally lay at our feet. And the real battle wasn't against the Sahara, wasn't to have the right technology or genetically modified super species of tree. The real battle was up here, how to convince farmers to work with what they've already got in bringing back a balanced level of tree cover to make agriculture viable.
So you had that moment of revelation, and there were these trees. And, you often describe, Tony, how you realised that these trees were desperately striving to come back, but they were connected to these ancient root systems that had tapped into the water below. So here you were planting these poor little seedlings in the top layer of the soil where there was very little organic matter, very little water, no microorganisms. The goats would come along and eat them. The insects would come along and eat them. The sun would bake them. No wonder they were dying. And yet here were these ancient root systems that were connected deep down into the water below. And it was really just a matter of, as you say, convincing the farmers that just letting them come back would be an opportunity for them to have trees again in their landscape. And what I'm fascinated in is that part of the equation. That the moment of revelation helped you see the path forward, but you still had a lot of work to do. And the extra work, the huge amount of work there was to work with farmers. And I want, if you can just describe us, how did that unfold? How did you get the first farmer? And I know you struggled with that. And but what happened there? Tell us through that.
Yeah, maybe if I go back even a little bit further, Scott, because before the podcast started, you were talking about your encounter in the boardroom. And these people who are demonized by environmental groups were actually human beings. And you were sensitive to that. As I was searching for a word, what is it that I did? The word friend came up. And again, taking the opportunity to write my biography made me reflect a lot. And I gave a lot of space in the early chapters talking about how I loved visiting farmers with my dad. Dad was a machinery, he had a machinery shop, farm machinery, and an excellent mechanic. And what I realized as I was writing was It wasn't a normal client-dealer relationship. That was certainly there. My dad was their friend.
Yeah.
And he was genuine, he was honest, and he helped them in many ways not related to the sale or fixing of machinery. And I think under the skin, I was picking this up without realizing it. When I went to Africa, I just loved being with farmers and talking to them about the life problems they were having and the difficulties in growing food, and celebrating with them when there was a birth or a wedding, and mourning with them when there was a death or an illness. Totally, in one sense, totally unrelated to trees and to the project. Certainly, you won't find that kind of information in the development textbooks, but just being a friend and being human, I think, if anything, if there was a single key, people trusted me, and I was concerned about their welfare as much or perhaps more than I was concerned about succeeding in reforestation. And the other thing, as I was writing, Myrtleford was a famous tobacco growing area. And I hated this crop with a vengeance. The farmers were pouring DDT onto this crop, and it was drifting into the rivers that we swam and fished in. And at times, big trout would come floating downstream, belly up. I hated that crop. But as I was writing and I went into the family history, these same farmers who after Dad fixed the machine, we would come into their homes and drink coffee with them and talk about something totally unrelated. They had fled fascism in their country. They were trying to create a better life in freedom. And at that point, there was very little understanding about pesticides and the dangers of tobacco. And so they, like your boardroom encounters, they were human beings. And so it mellowed me a lot, and it realized farmers in Africa, they weren't out to destroy the environment. They were just trying to put food on the table. Yeah. So that was the turning point, and that human relation, understanding what their drivers are. And then there was a point when I was able to ask, if we continue business as usual, destroying the environment, what will life be like for yourselves and your children in the very near future? And, my clients, my friends in Africa, they certainly weren't out to destroy the environment, simply wanting to put food on the table. And most of them weren't educated, but they were very, very intelligent people, and they knew full well things would only get worse. And if it followed its logical end, actually they would have to leave their ancestral land, everything that they knew and loved, and go elsewhere, go south for a better life. So when you come to that point and it's all on the table, actually there's no future in this, then we can start to rebuild. Well, what future do you want? And how will we achieve it? And fortunately, at an early point in the story, we made that discovery of the underground forest. Because tree planting in those conditions is a cow of an activity. It just doesn't work without throwing lots of money and resources into it. Fortunately, we had this simple, cheap, rapid method to promote with them and experiment with them on how to make life better.
Yeah, that's right, Tony. And you referenced, we had a bit of a chat before we recorded, and it really struck me. I listened to your book launch a while ago, a couple of weeks ago, and you're just talking about this work, and I just thought, God, there's so many parallels to the stuff that I was doing. And I was sitting in these boardrooms trying to convince these leaders and NGOs and other people saying, what are you doing in there? How can you even be in the same room as those people, those evil murderers? And I'm like, well, they don't seem to be that bad to me. And, they'd been following, for example, in the palm oil industry. The standard model in the palm oil industry was to come along and clear the forest, and often forest that had been already damaged through the plywood industry, for example. It wasn't much good as forest anymore from a productive point of view, they felt, and timber, still doing all the other things that forests do. home for biodiversity and all the rest of it, but they didn't see it that way. And this was for development. They had lots of poor people who would otherwise end up in the slums of Jakarta, and they were going to bring jobs and wealth to the country. And blimey, they did, and they deserve credit for it. It's been an economic miracle, the palm oil industry. But of course, on the negative side was this way that they did it from day one was go in and clear the forest and plant palm oil monoculture. And of course, not a lot of orangutans and other species can live in those places. And this is what they were being castigated for by the NGOs. And of course, along the way, there was labour issues came along and things like this. And so they had a list of things that weren't really good. But they could point to the schools, the hospitals, the health clinics, the infrastructure, social infrastructure, sanitation, all of the things that they'd brought to these rural communities with justification. But when you said to these guys, like, do you want to be linked to the death of orangutans? It's like, no, we don't. Well, but these are the people who can really do things. These are the people who can, if you said, look, if you wanted to do your business in this way, they would do it in that way. And you just had to open them to it. And when I was reflecting over the weekend, coming in, knowing that we were going to talk today, I was thinking, golly, Tony's done that work, but in a completely different context. Not in a boardroom. You were out in the farms and, I was sitting in air-conditioned boardrooms and, the 36th floor of buildings in Jakarta and in, grand offices and hotels meeting with people. You were out in the bush, but effectively the similarity was in the human connection, coming into those places as without judgment. Oh, these stupid farmers, they need educating. I've heard that so many times, particularly in years past, with the aid mentality. Oh, look what they're doing, these people. Oh, geez, we've got to educate them. And the number of people I've heard say, oh, we've got to educate farmers. It's like, hold on a second. These are pretty bright people who, they may have not ever seen the inside of a school, but they're survivors and they've been farming this land and in many ways, feeding not just whole communities, but nations with their production. But yes, there's consequences of the way they're doing it. And you'd identified those and they'd identified those. The Sahara was coming and you managed to be in the right place at the right time and brought your humanity to the equation. And I feel so strongly that this was this is the mystery of your work, Tony. And, you often say, and I know you're a very humble person, and you often say, oh, well, I didn't do anything. It was the farmers. Mm. And I'd like to hope that I'm in my humble moments, I say the same thing about the transitions that I've been involved with. It was the companies that did it. But you bought something because it wasn't happening until that moment you had that revelation there. And I'd love you just to explore that a little bit for us, Tony. You as you've mentioned already, you're a person of great faith, and I'm sure that's underpinned your life, not just your work. And I'm sure it's underpinned your humanity that you describe. But I also have reflected on my life, and I think it was my experiences in my childhood, and you've already touched on those lessons from your father and I know your mother, and these things that were very important to you. Can you just expand a bit on that for us, Tony?
Yeah, I guess there's so many directions we could take this, isn't there, Scott? But if I could go back to that point you're making about the importance of listening to the farmers and their knowledge, their skill. A false assumption of so many projects and even governments is that the farmers are the problem. They're the enemy. And if that's your starting point, then don't expect any quick wins or long-term successes. And perhaps that's part of the blessing that I had growing up in my family, where farmers were respected and treated as equals and listened to. My dad really listened to farmers, and I was absorbing this even without thinking, just the way he related to people, and he valued those relationships. And both mum and dad helping others in the community, new migrants coming out, helping them to settle and so on. And so I guess there was a kind of empathy there, but also this starting point where they might not have been to university, but we're equals. We have different colour skin, different religions, different backgrounds, but we share humanity. So maybe that was one of the strong points that gave me a head start in working with people to help them solve their own problems. So another thing that just came to mind is we in the West, particularly, are guilty of coming in to solve other people's problems as if they're a blank slate. And if you look at the history of so many cultures around the world, they had great civilizations, wonderful engineers, craftsmen, musicians, and so on. They have a history, and the genes are still there to do great things again. So what on earth drives us to think that we have a superior technology and a solution to solve their problems? Very much in the process that we took. And a lot of it was not thought out. It wasn't premeditated, just unrolled. A lot of it was just giving people the space to grasp, to realize their own gifts and ability to solve their own problems.
You've come to a really interesting point there, Tony, and I have had that experience as well. I remember talking to the chairman of Asia Pulp and Paper, this company that had become the pariah of the NGO movement in Indonesia. And yes, there'd been a lot of forest felled. There were conflicts with communities, and they were being just castigated and brutalised. And it had been for about 20 years. But somehow Greenpeace had effectively ratcheted up this campaign really strongly against them. And the chairman asked if I could talk to them about supporting them. And I remember going in there. He said to me, Scott, we've come to the point where we've got no idea what to do to get ourselves out of this, and we'd like you to help us. And I said, Pak Tegu, I just want to make it clear to you that I've got no idea either. But I reckon between the two of us and your amazing team and my amazing team, we could find a way. And you've mentioned that just so beautifully just there, that being open, and you didn't go in there with some grand plan. You just went in there and also open to co-creation, open to this idea that you're not there, you don't have to be the smart guy with all the answers. But, if you can sit around I used to sit around a table, but I guess you probably, sat under a meeting tree somewhere in a community and had these discussions. But everyone was open, and our human creativity could come into it. No one was shamed into silence because they didn't have an education or because you were white. You came in there and you looked at these people and you said, these are my friends and these are human beings, and what can we do together? And I look at your work and I think that's the essence of how you got to where you have created. And let's just quickly touch on the numbers, Tony. 5 million hectares or something in Niger alone of these trees that have sprung from the ground and are supporting communities. Millions of farmers across these regions of Africa, and you're in India, you're in Indonesia. I mean, this is an incredible achievement, and why I'm fascinated by it, I know I'm talking too much, this is ridiculous, but I just love reflecting on this because I often talk to young people, and you touched on it at the start, there's so much despair in the world around the lack of change we're seeing on climate. And I see all these people, we've got to change people, we've got to change them. I'm like, you can't change people, you've got to be with them and support them and inspire them to find their own way forward. And it seems to me that your work has been the embodiment of that approach. And that's why I'm fascinated by it.
Thank you. If I could pick up on one of those points, yes, to this day, the biggest thing I look forward to when I get to go back to field countries is to learn something. To this day, you'd think after 40 years, I'd know all there's needed to know about Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. Every time I learn something new from the farmers, and going back to those early days, sitting on the mat under a tree or in a grass hut, after discovering the underground forest, I said to the farmers, honestly, look, I think this will work, but I'm not 100% sure. Would you come on a journey with me in co-learning? Let's experiment on a small corner of your farm. And if it works, good and well, take it further the next year. If it doesn't, they're your trees, it's your farm, do what you like. I don't want you to suffer loss. And lo and behold, we got to the next year, and for those experimenting with it, it worked. And there were benefits, not measured in a test tube, tangible benefits that people could quantify. And so they said, look, Tony's a bit crazy, but no harm was done. And there's actually some pluses. We're going to take this a little bit further. And it was so exciting, to this day, I don't drive in there in my limo, in a limo as the expert. I go in as a co-learner, and that's very, very important. I think it puts people at ease.
Yeah.
It puts them in the driver's seat. And while I didn't formulate that term, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, it's actually perfect. It's not Tony managed. It's not World Vision, my organization managed. It's farmer managed or community managed, or in some cases, pastoralist managed. And that's another one of the secrets. Why is this working? Why those millions of hectares? Well, they're shaping this thing. It's not a fixed formula. They're shaping this thing in each instant to suit their personal needs and to achieve their own objectives. And FMNR on one farm to the next can be a very, very different beast, but it's still FMNR.
Yeah, I think so. That's right. And look, just so people can understand, I should just say I'm talking to Tony Rinaudo, the forest maker, and for this amazing work that Tony has been doing over so many decades to support farmers to regenerate trees on their land. And as Tony mentioned just then, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. And so, Tony, you started, I think it was just, I think I'm right in saying it was just 4 brave pioneer farmers, was it, in the little community where you were?
Well, about 10 farmers in as many villages, yeah.
Right, and they took the risk, and this Tony guy, bit of a weirdo, we don't know what he's talking about, but they took the risk, and so just so people can understand, these trees, these tiny little bushes that you described, were being eaten by the goats and insects and things like that, but they'd never really been given a chance to flourish. But because the ancient root systems were there, they were tapped into the water below. And so the growth rates that eventually emerged were extraordinary, right? And so suddenly these trees were just booming up into the landscape, and the farmers were able to go, holy smokes, this is amazing. And we could cut that branch off there for a bit of firewood, or actually, that we need a bit more timber for a new building or something like this. And so this is where you started the farmers started to manage these trees that were coming up. And so we're not talking about magnificent, beautiful forests that people might think are these magnificent places. These are often trees that have a branch lopped off here and a branch lopped off there, but they're serving. These trees are serving, and they do bring biodiversity back. Because it's not as if the farmers are stripping them bare every year. So quickly just talk us through that so people can understand what's happened, Tony.
Yeah, so it's basically coppicing, and maybe you have some non-rural listeners. If you've ever driven past a vineyard in the winter after the farmers have pruned all the excess branches, in the autumn, a grapevine will have maybe 20, 30 branches. It looks like bad hair day, just going in all directions. And that farmer cuts back to just 2 lead branches and ties them to the wire for a purpose. In the case of vineyards, they're looking for higher and better quality grape yield. The same principles apply when you're regrowing a tree from a stump. So each farmer is going to have a different objective. It could be for cutting the wind speed that will then protect their crops. It could be for fuel wood. It could be that particular tree is a wild fruiting species and they want it to grow fruit. They will manage the regrowth, the number of stems, how severely they prune them, the way they prune them. They'll manage them according to their objective, what they want to get out of that tree. And incidentally, Scott, you're absolutely right. The bulk of this work is done on farmland and grazing land, but the same principles apply on restoring forests. And we have now community managed forests, which are biodiverse hotspots they're like magnets for wildlife and bird life to come back into these dense, diverse forests. So it's not only on agricultural land, although that is the bulk of where it's happening.
Yeah, no, I've seen those pictures of I think there's a hilly landscape that you've got this picture where it was just completely barren. And then 10 or so years later, it's just covered in trees and green. And I remember you talking about how the first time you'd wandered over that landscape, there was just no sound of life. And I remember, I think you mentioned in our first podcast that, you went back there some years later and you could hear the birds and the biodiversity had come back in droves. And of course, this is wonderful. And I don't doubt that, the farming community, the farmers go in there and maybe harvest some trees or some fruit from time to time as well. These are not forests that are set aside as pristine national parks. These are areas that still support the community, but they do support the biodiversity as well.
They're functional forests. The farmers get compensated through carbon credits. they prune and manage the trees, so they're harvesting fodder, fuel wood. Occasionally they're harvesting trunks, but often it's the case that they've left multiple trunks per stump. And ultimately they will leave the main lead to grow into a full-size tree because they're getting compensated with carbon credits. So yes, the community are very much benefiting as they manage that forest restoration. But talk about wildlife, water infiltration, biodiversity. It's just such a contrast to that rocky barren hill that I first walked over years ago.
Amazing. And so, Tony, I think you and I could probably have a chat here for the next 5 hours, but might get difficult for the listeners. So I want to just come back to this, thinking about the future. And as you've said at the start of our chat here, you're at that stage of your life and your career where you want to inspire others. I'm sort of in that similar place. I want to make it clear you're a few years older than I am, but but I'm sort of in that similar place where I'm thinking, wow, we've got to, it's great that we can look back on our life of the things that we've been involved in and feel good about that. But the world's in a bit of a bad way, and one of the things that concerns me deeply is, well, not just climate change, but it's I've read a lot of studies recently coming out about just how despairing young people are at the future. They feel that there is no hope. You touched on this at the start. There is no hope, and for all of the protests and the school strikes and Greta, fantastic, raising awareness, nothing much seems to be changing, and emissions are still going through the roof, and the consequences of climate change are not just on our doorstep. We're in it. It's here with us now, and I think the inspiration that is in your work, Tony, and is of course the trees that have been established and the higher crop yields that the farmers are getting. These are measures, if you like, of the success of that work that you've done and the lives that you've impacted. And this is an incredibly positive thing. But I truly believe that the real essence of what we could learn from your journey, from that moment when you had that revelation and you let the air out of your tire and you said, what's that bush? The moment there has not only done all of those things to support so many lives being changed and all of these things, but it's what happened in that moment and then what you did after that moment that can give us hope. And I believe, should give hope to all of these young people who are looking at the world. And I don't say they're waiting for someone else to fix it because they're young. They're not leaders of companies yet. They're not politicians. They're not, and so many young people are stepping up into that place. But I think the essence of the inspiration for me when I look at Tony did it. Tony did it. How did he do it? Well, he did it just by being himself. He did it by, and who was Tony? Well, Tony was shaped by his life in rural Australia. You've mentioned your father many times, and, we've all got that. I often say to young people, it's great that you're going to university, please do. It's great that you're learning to be a carpenter or a plumber, please do. But you have everything you need without any study to make the world a better place. And it's you. It's your essential self. It's your soul. It's your inner wisdom. Because I like to think that most people are pretty good. I wonder sometimes when I see the sort of things that are happening in Ukraine and stuff like that right now, but I wonder at those leaders who have made decisions to do bad things. I wonder what happened to them in their childhood. I suspect they didn't have a father like yours. So I think most of us have inherent good in us. And I think that what your life work demonstrates, Tony, is that if you live truly to who you are, and don't get swayed by our culture, which rewards people for their wealth and their ego and their smart comments and things like that. And we have social media that rewards people with likes and followers when they attack others. I think your life is an example where you've just been a human being and you've brought that humanity to everything you've done, not just your work, but life, because it isn't work and private life, is it? It's life. That's the lesson for me of your work. And I just like to, if you could reflect on that a little bit and maybe think about how do we then take that lesson to the children of the world, the young people of the world, and even the older people in the world. It's not too late to start. It's not too late to find a different way of your working. And so could you just reflect on that for me a bit, Tony?
Thank you, Scott. And I think it's so true what you say, that everything they need, they already have it. It's their own person, their own self. And I think what young people lack, and what I certainly lacked as a young person, was confidence, belief in myself. I lacked that. But I was also a very, very angry young person at the state of the world, the pollution, the wars, the use of pesticides in my own valley, the deforestation. I'm very angry. And so I had this passion to do something about it. And just go the next step, go as far as you can see, which initially might not be very far. And I certainly had no conception of how my life would unfold. So go as far as you can see. And when you get there, even if it's only 1 meter, one day ahead, when you get there, you'll always be able to see further and take the next step. And I'm such an ordinary person. If I can be used to do those things, then surely anybody else, within the gifts that you have, within the sphere of influence that you have, it may be the sort of work that I did, but most likely it'll be something else. We're all so different. You follow that direction, that inner direction that you have, and life will unfold. You'll have a much more satisfying life when you're true to yourself, compared to if you just conform to what society's expectations are of you. Yeah.
That's the essence. I think you nailed it, mate. I truly believe that. And this is why I was so excited to talk to you again, because I truly believe that, you are a great example of what can be achieved if you just, and I love this idea of, like Michael Looney, the Australian cartoonist and philosopher, has this lovely cartoon. It's called The Garden Gate. And beyond the Garden Gate, it's just stars. It's a starry night. And it doesn't have any words, but just encourages you to go beyond that. And he has another wonderful cartoon that I used to have on my wall in my office, which was How to Get There. And it's just like, keep going out towards the horizon. Stop every now and then for a cup of tea and, a bit of a refreshment, but keep going. That's how you get there. And I think, as you've just so beautifully captured, Tony, that often you don't know. Like, you've just got a passion and you want to do something, but you don't know how. People said to me, how does a young bloke from, growing up in Cranbourne end up, sitting in the boardrooms and these companies in Singapore and Jakarta and, Nestle and all these sort of things? Well, I think the answer is, and I keep saying to people, I don't know. And I can't plot you the 10 steps to success. There's all these, books like 10 steps to bringing change in the world. I think there's one step. And that one step is to live truly to yourself. And I think, when you do that, you can, if the stars and the universe align for you, and I believe it always will, you can have such an impact in the world. And you are a great example of that, Tony. And I wanted to not only talk to you, but talk to you about that. You're such a humble person, but you don't need, no one's blowing trumpets here to say that is the essential ingredient. We're saying to people, just be you. That's how you get there. That's how we're going to bring change. And I think, Tony Rinaudo, the forest maker, is a great example of that. So really, Tony, I want to thank you so much. And if there's any last reflection before we get to the end, if there's anything you'd like to just share with everyone, share with the listeners.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just add a little bit to that, I believe everybody's got a purpose in life. So discover your purpose and then pursue it without self-doubt. And you mentioned just keep going. You can be sure of this. There'll be opposition, there'll be ridicule, there'll be obstacles. But if you're sure of your purpose, just keep going.
You'll get there.
I'll finish there. Scott. Otherwise, we won't end this talk.
Yeah. No, look, fantastic. Thank you so much, Tony. And the book is available. Where's the book available, Tony?
So the publisher is ISCAST, ISCAST.org/TFU/.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I'll put it in the text for the podcast so people can find it. And it's where Tony describes his life and his life's work helping farmers to re-establish forest in their landscape all across Africa and beyond now in other countries of the world too. So my privilege, Tony, to be able to talk with you as always. And I wish you the best for the future, your work to inspire not just young people, but people of all ages and generations. And I'm excited to be able to watch that and to see what unfolds. So, Tony Rinaudo, thank you for joining our podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to catch up again, Scott. Thank you.